Hello everyone, this is Ian Robinson with Creative 111, and today we're going to talk about stylizing footage. In order to create different styles for the footage, you need to be familiar with the process of color correction before you actually start adding a little bit more style to the footage itself. So when we're talking about color correction, the first thing you want to do is consider the compression of the video clip that you want to color correct. For example, in the project panel here on the left-hand side, I've got drive.mp4. This video clip is highly compressed. I chose MP4 because a lot of DSLR cameras shoot natively MP4 files, so this will be pertinent to many of you. But if you have a situation where you've shot some video and you know it's going to be a challenging environment where you're going to have really bright areas and really dark areas, you probably want to try and get a nicer camera that can shoot less compressed footage, like super uncompressed footage like Blackmagic RAW or Apple ProRes RAW, or simply just something that has a lossless codec like Apple ProRes, or Avid DNx HD, just something that is less compressed than something like an MP4. But okay, now that we've talked about that, let's actually look at this individual video clip. I'm going to go down here to the timeline and I'll grab my playhead and I'll just scrub down the timeline, and you'll notice the exposure changes as things move. It's not really changing, but when I get up to this area here, you can see I've got this over bright, blown out sky, meaning I'm never going to get the blue pixels back into this image. This is just lost data. But I can make some corrections to this to give it a better baseline, so when we actually stylize the footage, it will take on more of the actual attributes of the other looks that people have created. So to start, let's go down to the timeline and select the footage, and then apply the Lumetri Color effect. So I'm going to go up under Effect, I'll go down to Color Correction, and I'll choose Lumetri Color. Now, if I open up the basic correction area here, you'll notice in the tone section, I can make some adjustments to things like the exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Now, before I make these adjustments, it's important to note that each different person's computer is going to have a different color calibration to their screen unless everybody has agreed to a specific setting and they've actually set up calibrations, etc., etc. So a way to get around this so that you understand the data that the file actually contains is to use something called scopes or vector scopes. And After Effects has vector scopes built into the software. So I'm going to go to the upper right corner of the interface here, click on the double arrows, and go to the color section. In the color section, you should notice now I have a new workspace. And so next to the project panel, I have Lumetri Scopes. Now, you may have different scopes than I do, so let me show you how these work. If you right-click over any of the scopes, you'll see a list of the scopes here, and the check marks will toggle. For example, if I turn off Vector Scope YUV, now I only have this one scope here. So I'm going to turn Vector Scope YUV on, and I want you to note that I also have Waveform Luma on. If you have Waveform and it's something else, you can go here under Waveform Type and make sure Luma is chosen that way. So with these two scopes, what I'm going to do is first focus on setting the brightness of the image. Then I'll focus on dealing with the color. So over here on the left, this scope is called a Waveform Luma monitor, and it's only focusing on the brightness or the luminance of the different pixels. So if I'm at frame 0 here, you can see I've got some dark pixels, but nothing that's actually black. So I'm going to go to my Effect Controls panel by clicking on the tab here, and I'll go to the blacks setting, and I'll just scrub that to the left to bring some of this data down. And you notice when it hits 0, what I'm doing is pushing this stuff here, which is called trace data. I'm pushing those pixels down to 0 levels. So the parts of the motorcycle are now more black. So I'll go ahead and just move my current time indicator down the timeline here, and you notice the sky towards the end is super bright. So if I go to the whites section here, it's going to adjust the top brightness of the pixels. And I like the fact that they are up at 100, but notice when I start scrubbing, it's clamped and everything is getting clipped off here at 100%. So here I'm going to make the whites setting a little bit down like so. And actually, I'll just set it back to its original setting. And then shadows and highlights are just underneath the blacks and whites. For example, shadows are brighter areas than the blacks section, and the highlights are a little less bright area than the whites section. So here, I'm going to scrub on the highlights and bring that down. And you notice now the sky isn't quite as bright overall, but that's also pushing all this other trace data down. So I'll go ahead and bring this down a little bit, but not too much. I'll just bring it down to something like -53. Then I'll scrub back here in the timeline and look at this section here. And, you know, as I'm looking at that, I might want to actually increase the contrast. So what contrast does is actually expand both directions for the trace data. So I'm just going and making this a little bit brighter by increasing the contrast like so. All right, so now that I've actually expanded this a little bit and we have more contrast, I'm going to click on the FX button to toggle it off and on, and you can see it already looks a lot better. Let's deal with this color cast here. Okay, this scope is called the Vector Scope YUV. I'm pulling these up by right-clicking so I can see the names. So yellow, red, magenta, blue, cyan, and green. So this trace data is showing me that it is majority yellow and has, you know, some green and some magenta, just a little bit, but more yellow. Okay. So if I want to adjust the temperature, I can click and drag here. And if I click and drag to the right, it's making things warmer. And if I click and drag to the left, it's making things cooler, which I'm definitely going to cool this off a little bit so that it's a little bit more balanced. Now I can also adjust the tint, which is going to adjust it differently, like between the green and the magenta. And I don't need to make any adjustments there, so I'll set that to 0. Now that we have our initial correction applied, then we can go to the creative area. And in the creative area, I can apply a look, which is basically a preset. So I'm going to click on this drop down here, and I'll choose this Fuji Eterna 250D setting, and that's going to stylize this footage. Now, just to give you an example, if I want to see what this looks like without doing my basic correction, in that area, I can uncheck the active section. And here you can see now it has much more magenta in it than when I actually have the original correction applied, or the base correction. Now, I'm going to go here to the look, and I'll click on this, and I'll go down here to this SL Blue Cold look, which is of course going to cool things off and give it a nice cool look. And I can see that here in this scope, and I can definitely see it over here. But if I didn't apply that base correction, does that look cool to you? No, it's got a lot more yellow in that image. So when you actually go to apply different creative looks, it's important to do a basic correction. And when you do that basic correction, you want to make sure to use the color workspace and pull up the Lumetri scopes. My favorite scopes to work with are Waveform Luma to set the brightness of the image, and then Vector Scope YUV so you can actually make some adjustments within the colors themselves. So thanks for checking this out. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I'll see you next week.